A newly appointed police chief enters his precinct undercover, hoping to witness his officers' true behavior when they think no one important is watching. But when a white officer, mistaking him for a nobody, spits in his face, the entire room is moments away from a revelation that will shake them all. On a humid Tuesday morning in August, Richard Nelson stepped out of his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small city nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. Dressed in a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he hardly looked like a man who had spent 20 years climbing the ranks in law enforcement. And that was exactly his plan. Richard believed in seeing the unfiltered reality of his precinct, not the polished version presented in official meetings. As a black man stepping into leadership at a department tainted by rumors of misconduct, he wanted an honest look at the culture within. And what better way than to blend in unnoticed? The parking lot bustled with officers coming and going. Richard took in the scene, noting the casual conversations and the occasional glance in his direction. No one recognized him, which was expected. His appointment had only been announced a few days prior, and he had deliberately kept his arrival quiet until the formal introduction later that morning. Adjusting the brim of his baseball cap, he took a deep breath. The weight of his mission, to expose and eliminate the toxicity within the department, pressed heavily on him. He was no stranger to resistance, but he knew this job would challenge him in ways he hadn't yet faced. As he approached the building, faint laughter carried through the air. Slipping through a side entrance, he blended in with the hum of conversations and ringing phones. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the polished tile floors, and the scent of stale coffee lingered in the air. He walked slowly, studying the dynamics around him. Groups of officers clustered near desks, some swapping stories, others focused on paperwork. No one paid him much attention until he stopped near the break room. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise. Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him, a smug grin on his face. His badge read, "Officer Daniels." Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, watching with amusement. Before Richard could respond, Daniels continued, his tone laced with disdain. "Lost, are we? This isn't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard froze, the words hitting him like a blow. He debated whether to correct the officer immediately or let the moment unfold further. Daniels stepped closer, raising his voice for the audience's benefit. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the onlookers. Richard clenched his jaw, his heartbeat quickening. As he opened his mouth to speak, Daniels leaned in, then, without warning, spit directly in his face. Time seemed to freeze. Richard inhaled sharply as the warm saliva trickled down his cheek. Around him, the laughter grew louder. One officer slapped a table, doubling over with amusement, while another muttered about putting riffraff in their place. Richard's mind raced, but he remained composed. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face with deliberate movements. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice steady and firm. Daniels smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group erupted in laughter again. Richard said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked down the hallway toward the main office. Just then, the precinct's intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. Inside, the room buzzed with chatter as officers filed in, some sipping coffee, others laughing over inside jokes. Richard entered through a side door, now holding a folder bearing the precinct's official seal. Standing just out of sight, he observed the room full of familiar faces, some still chuckling from the earlier encounter. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache, called for order. "All right, settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction today." The room fell silent, curiosity gripping every officer. Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed, still wearing a smug expression, clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Harris cleared his throat. As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been anticipating his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department. Richard stepped forward, his measured footsteps echoing in the room. As he reached the podium, the atmosphere tensed. He placed the folder on the lectern and slowly scanned the faces before him, his calm demeanor only amplifying the unease in the room. Daniels's smirk wavered. His face paled as realization dawned. Around him, officers exchanged nervous glances, some whispering, others staring in stunned silence. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The room was deathly quiet. The color drained from Daniel's face, his earlier confidence vanishing. Richard's gaze locked onto him for a beat longer than necessary before shifting to the rest of the room. "This morning," Richard continued, "I arrived in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department unfiltered, as it truly operates. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur spread through the crowd, but Richard raised a hand, immediately silencing it. "In just a short time, I've observed behavior that is not only unprofessional but completely unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The toxic culture that has been allowed to thrive here ends today." A heavy stillness settled over the room as the weight of his words sank in. Daniel shifted uneasily, his eyes darting downward. Richard stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his voice sharp but composed. "Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." He let the silence stretch, watching the officers squirm under his gaze. "This morning some of you laughed, believing you were witnessing a powerless man being put in his place. Let me remind you, every person who walks through these doors deserves respect, badge or not." His words sliced through the room like a knife. No one dared move. Richard let the tension linger, his stare unwavering. Every officer could feel the weight of his presence. Daniel shifted again, sweat forming on his brow, his discomfort painfully obvious. But Richard wasn't finished. "I understand that change is difficult," he said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "But let me be absolutely clear. This department will no longer tolerate behavior that undermines the dignity of any individual, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium and moved deliberately toward the group of officers, his presence both commanding and controlled. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, stopping just a few feet from him. Daniels flinched, his earlier bravado completely shattered. "You," Richard continued, locking eyes with him, "are the embodiment of everything wrong with this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and the very community we are sworn to protect." Daniel stammered, "Chief, I didn't know." "That," Richard interrupted, his voice cutting, "is exactly the problem. You didn't care to know. You acted without thought because you assumed the man in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is the reason this department has lost the trust of the people it serves." The room remained frozen, every officer stunned into silence. Richard turned his focus back to the group. "What I witnessed today wasn't just one man's mistake, it was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice aren't just tolerated, but encouraged. That ends now." He stepped back toward the podium, his voice rising with conviction. "I have spent my career fighting for justice, not just on the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But let me make this clear. As long as I am chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." Richard let his words settle before giving a brief nod to Captain Harris. Then, in a firm and unwavering tone, he concluded, "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is just the beginning." A wave of gasps spread through the room. Daniel's face flushed red, his jaw tightening as he avoided the glances of his colleagues. Richard remained unfazed, standing firm. "This isn't about punishment," he stated with conviction. "It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to it, then this isn't the place for you." His gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with each officer. "If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. But understand this: I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended in a heavy silence. Officers exited without their usual conversations, the weight of Richard's words still hanging in the air. From the podium, he watched as Daniels stormed out, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. Other officers avoided eye contact, their faces reflecting guilt, uncertainty, and quiet introspection. Back in his office, Richard sank into his chair and let out a deep breath. He knew this was only the beginning. Changing years of ingrained attitudes wouldn't happen overnight. Some might never change at all. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to be liked. He had come to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang. It was Captain Harris. "Chief, I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have," Harris admitted, his tone careful. "Thanks, Captain," Richard replied. "But the real work starts now. I want a full review of Daniel's history on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything." "You got it," Harris said, then hesitated. "And, Chief, I think you shook a few of them today. In a good way." Richard hung up, allowing himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction before turning to the stack of paperwork in front of him. Over the next few weeks, the precinct began to shift. Officers who once laughed along with Daniel's antics now kept their distance. Word of his suspension spread quickly, sending an unspoken message throughout the department. Richard made it a point to walk the halls regularly, greeting officers as he passed. His presence was a constant reminder of the new leadership. Some embraced the change. One day, Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached Richard hesitantly. "Chief, I need to admit something. I stayed quiet before, let things slide, because I was scared of retaliation. But I don't want to be part of that anymore. I want to do better." Richard studied her for a moment before offering a firm but encouraging response. "That's all I ask. It starts with you." But not everyone was willing to change. Daniels filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. Richard refused to back down. Accountability was not negotiable. A review of Daniels's record uncovered a disturbing pattern of misconduct: excessive force, inappropriate remarks, and repeated complaints. His appeal was denied, reinforcing Richard's message that the days of turning a blind eye to corruption were over. Progress continued, but resistance remained. Conversations about implicit bias and community relations were met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed the dialogue, others resented the shift. Still, Richard pressed forward. Even small victories, a recruit speaking up, an officer reconsidering their actions, were steps toward meaningful change. One morning, Richard attended a community event where a young boy hesitantly approached him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "I am," Richard answered with a smile. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy whispered. Richard crouched to meet his gaze. I can't change the past, he admitted gently. But I promise you, we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay? The boy nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. Moments like this reminded Richard why he had taken the job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from perfect, but undeniably different. Officers unwilling to adapt had been replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for a fair and respectful department. The once skeptical community began to notice signs of real change, a renewed effort to rebuild trust and mend divides. One evening, Richard stood in the precinct's main hallway, watching as officers wrapped up their shifts. The energy in the room felt different. The laughter and camaraderie weren't at someone's expense, but were genuine and inclusive. He knew challenges still lay ahead. Change was never easy. But for the first time he felt hopeful. It wasn't just possible. It was worth the fight.